in my conclusion. So the title of the paper that I'm going to present is Narrowing the Gap Between Theory and Practice, Matthew Lipman's Community of Inquiry and its Current State in the Philippines. So the questions beside the title, those are my son's questions. Abstract. So let me just go over the abstract of the paper. So this paper presents Matthew Lipman's critique of traditional pedagogy, as seen in his work Thinking in Education, which was published in 2003. Lipman points out that traditional pedagogy does not foster reflective thinking. This paper also wishes to discuss the historical development of the practice of community of inquiry in the Philippines from the time that it was introduced by Dr. Zosimo E in 1996 to Manila Public Schools, and in 2012 to the Teachers of Ayala Foundation Incorporated Teacher Training Institute. So this article or this paper makes the claim that Lipman's critique of the traditional pedagogy mirrors the situation of Philippine classrooms. I wish to further argue that it is for this reason that the practice of community of inquiry is still cannot be fully implemented in the country. So according to Matthew Lipman, the school is a background where the future of the society is being fought. He adds that whereas schools must be initiators of change, most of them remain conservative as seen in the way teachers are trained in their craft. In most cases, teachers are taught to use manuals, textbooks, and in this training, the teaching ability is measured simply by their capacity to learn and memorize the manuals. Consequently, the change needed in the teaching profession cannot be initiated in the school system because of this practice. With a focus on the curriculum, shifting to making students master skills, which is aimed at future employability, where do we situate reasonableness in education? Just like their teachers whose ability to teach is measured by their ability to follow the manuals, the students' capacity to think gets equated with how much of the lesson they have memorized. Likewise, their success is then measured by the scores they get in their exams and their performance tasks. For obvious reasons, educators must start to realize that exam and performance tasks do not necessarily equate with the student's ability to think. Rather, they measure the student's ability to copy. Lipman notes that pedagogical problem is, at the least in its first stage, to transform the child who is already a thinking child into a child who already thinks well. To address this problem, there must be a program that would enable children to address such cognitive tasks and making decisions for themselves. Educational systems which aim at teaching thinking skills to students must consider the idea of transforming children into philosophers or decision makers. In other words, the system must teach children to become more thoughtful, more considerate, and more reasonable individuals. With this, we realize that there is a need for the development of critical practice as methodical activity in education. But in order to develop such practice, it must be distinguished from what may be referred to as the normal practice. A normal practice can be characterized as customary, habitual, traditional, unreflective, while a critical practice is the opposite. What is normal cannot turn into a critical practice through the following: criticism of the practice of one's colleagues, self-criticism, correction of others, and self-correction. Reflection upon practice includes inquiry into it, while an effective inquiry includes appropriate intervention. Indeed, a reflective paradigm assumes education to be an inquiry. In the second chapter of Lipman's Thinking in Education, he strengthens his criticism of traditional pedagogical practices. He goes on discussing how teachers resist change and how schools refuse to take responsibility for the future of the educational system. The teacher's education program cannot just be redesigned unless they have identified clearly the aims of education. Lipman notes that in case knowledge becomes disposable so that there is no retention of knowledge, what they have learned gets easily forgotten once examinations are over. Teachers of traditional pedagogy know that the purpose of education is to instill knowledge, and yet even this goal is not completely achieved because of the failure of the system to create an impact on the minds of the students. There are suggestions for critical thinking. The problem, however, is that teachers insist that they have been teaching for thinking and that nothing needs to be done. As discussed earlier, Lippmann made significant criticism against the standard teaching practices of educators, specifically how they tend to resist change in the system. Teachers are not prepared to teach critical thinking, and there are no efforts to engage students to think imaginatively. He stresses that there was very little teaching for judgment, basically because educators do not recognize the importance of teaching it. Teachers are also not able to create connection between critical, creative, and caring thinking. With the criticism, Lippmann, together with Anne Margaret Sharp, introduced community of inquiry as an approach to teach children critical thinking. Lippmann's founding of Philosophy for Children started when he realized in 1970s that his children's school did not give them instruction in reasoning. The problem raised by Lippmann is that schools fail to teach children how to think. Thus, he introduces the idea of making children be familiar with philosophy. He notes that when philosophy is properly taught, it could bring significant improvement in students' thinking. This can be done by using the community of inquiry as a pedagogy. So I hope the ones at the side is clear enough. Those are handwritings of my students last semester. I did this particular session with them before we discussed ethics. So they do not have proper, well, I have not taught them anything about ethics yet. I just simply presented them with a text as a stimulus. And from the text, these are the questions that they have raised. When do you expect something in return? Is the golden rule the same as Hammurabi's quote? Why ask for the same thing when you can just pay instead? This is coming from, the text that I used is Matthew Lippmann's Lisa. And it's a story about one of the characters going out on a date. And the guy was expecting something during the date. And from there, these are the questions that they have raised. In this same class, these are students of communication arts and behavioral science. At the end of the semester, what I asked them to do is to get cases coming from the industry that they are working on, and luckily they're already done with their practicum. So they were able to come up with cases which are happening in the workplace, and from the cases that they were able to get, they tried to apply the ethical theories that we have studied. So at first they were hesitant to do it. They were arguing that they just wish to write a paper instead of working on a community of inquiry again. But when we started, 3 hours was not enough to finish the discussion. So there, Lippmann aims to convert the classroom into a community of inquiry where students listen to one another with a certain level of respect towards each other's idea. Lippmann wants to transform education into a laboratory for rationality where students learn to be reasonable so that they can grow up to be reasonable citizens, reasonable companions, reasonable parents. Lippmann argues that knowledge should be finished product of the inquiry process. It is logically organized in such a way that facts supported with evidence and opinions are accompanied by reason and judgments, are made with relevant criteria. Moreover, the community of inquiry is also a process which has a sense of direction. It moves where the argument takes it. It is dialogical. In such situations, we must see the teacher as the one who mediates and not one who dominates the discussion. In this approach, we do not run the risk of indoctrinating students because the students are the ones who deliver the discussion based on the experiences and their perspectives. So it is important to note that Lippmann was aware of the dilemma of educators. He knows that teachers are not given a free hand on how and what to teach their students because these are matters which are already decided on by the school districts. On the other hand, he observes that children in kindergarten are curious, lively, imaginative, and inquisitive. These qualities dwindle as they age, especially when these philosopher-like qualities are not nurtured. As a consequence, children eventually perceive only the social aspect of school and forget about the educational aspect. Their enthusiasm for learning is not sustained because because of the rigidity of the structured learning process. So in the current system, we see how classroom discussions are focused on factual details and students are being numerically graded through their scores in the examinations, which does not actually speak of how much they have learned, but of how much they remember. On this note, Van der Leeuw suggests that reflection and reasoning cannot be realized when we only reserve separate hours of a week for collective exploration of philosophical questions. One might ask, if traditional schools are not open to the idea of transforming itself into becoming a more reflective and inquiry-based education system, is it possible for communities of inquiry to, without transforming the whole system? So David Kennedy suggests that this could or could not work, considering that there might be inconsistencies because what is being taught in the classroom of community of inquiry and the traditional classroom setting, which confuse students, yet it could work because wherever the community of inquiry is, wherever the community of inquiry actually forms, it will through its very operation work to transform its setting from transmission to dialogical. So I now move to probably the part of the summary of my paper. So, narrowing the gap between theory and practice. So, the new curriculum for pre-service teachers education encourages deep and complex knowledge, which emphasizes the acquisition and cognitive processes, or more conceptual, theoretical, abstract forms of knowledge. The importance of understanding how knowledge and skills are contextualized are meaningful in specific problem, situation, or context inquiry. Alan Bernardi suggests that teachers must have an appropriation or appreciation for the theories of knowledge and the technical strategies to be used in addressing specific aspects of learning. So let me just go over this part. So it is noticeable that these new courses in the pre-service teachers curriculum are highly philosophical in nature. We read terms such as cognition, reflection, critical thinking, and nature of knowledge. Yet when we review the actual curriculum of pre-service teachers in the country, there is an absence of courses such as philosophy of education or epistemology. This is true even in the top colleges of education. So I tried to review the curriculum of the University of Santo Tomas and the University of the Philippines. In the University of Santo Tomas, philosophy of education, and instead of philosophy of education and epistemology, the University of Santo Tomas College of Education offers history and philosophy of science to science majors only, philosophical and ethical foundations of values education to religious education majors. It is interesting to note that these two courses are not assigned to the Department of Philosophy. They have courses which are supposed to be philosophical in nature, such as Principles of Teaching 1 and 2, which include the foundations of disciplines, as well as Facilitating Learning, which teaches contemporary theories and researches on the cognitive, metacognitive, and motivational, sociocultural, and individual difference factors in the acquisition of knowledge. Both of these courses, I found out, have been a common prerequisite to Psychology 1. In addition, they offer scientific reasoning and critical thinking, which is a study of methodological components of social sciences as tool to explain certain phenomena in the understanding of logical reasoning and critical thinking. Finally, there is a seminar in education which discusses the historical, legal, and philosophical foundations of education. Unfortunately, the only subject assigned to the Department of Philosophy is logic and sometimes professional deontology. This seems anomalous if we consider assigning subjects to those who are equipped to teach courses according to their academic preparation and research. The presence of the term thinking in a course title does not immediately warrant that it belongs to psychology, nor the term social sciences exclusive to sociological theory. The foundation or on the underlying theories of different fields and concepts are philosophical and could be appropriately handled only by the teachers who have specific preparation for them. The University of the Philippines does not offer philosophy of education in the undergraduate program. Instead, they have educational thought and practice. In the graduate level, however, they offer philosophy of education, psychophilosophical foundation of education, philosophy of curriculum, and seminars in philosophy of Philippine education, which are taught by professors equipped to handle the course. They are philosophy major philosophy major who crossed over to education. This being said, we cannot expect teachers to efficiently teach reflective thinking to their students because of their lack of training and experience. It would be a challenge to bring Matthew Lipman's thoughts into the Philippine classroom precisely because teachers are not fully equipped to take on the task. This is evidenced by the work done by Dr. Zosimo E. So the Community of Inquiry in the Philippines, or P4C. So Dr. Zosimo E introduced the practice of reflective thinking in the elementary classrooms of philosophy for children after he attended the Mendham workshop of the Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children in 1996 and in 2000. From 1992 to 1996, the faculty members of the Department of Philosophy of the University of the Philippines Diliman were giving lectures on logic, epistemology, metaphysics, ethics to the teachers of Manila public schools who had initially found philosophy intimidating and esoteric. So this endeavor did not lead immediately to a concrete outcome. In 1996, through the initiative of Dr. Paraluman Heron, the conduct was re-established and the trainings resumed. There were lecture discussions on critical and creative thinking. The teachers proved to be receptive of the ideas. However, when they were tasked to do their own teaching materials, they had a difficulty in working on their own manuals. They claimed to have been using the pedagogy but did not have the vocabulary for their practice. And since the concept of higher order thinking was already introduced to them by the DepEd, they were interested to acquire the skills so that they could eventually teach it to their students. The eager students or the eager teachers realized that schooling is not always educating and that educating has to involve enabling their students to become better thinkers. Some of them became critical of their own practice and started to evaluate its philosophical underpinnings. The challenge was, although the teachers were receptive of the practice, they could not immediately use it in their classroom because of the bureaucracy in their respective schools. Some of them even became wary of the new techniques and method, reverting back to the feeling that what they were doing was sufficient enough. So nonetheless, the other members of the department continued to train public school teachers in Manila for the next 2 years. The group conducted workshops and regular meetings with teachers in the elementary school and secondary schools in Manila. Group of 25 teachers each began conducting weekly sessions in the Juan Luna Elementary School. For 2 years, the group was able to train 200 teachers and 35 of whom were convinced to take the second level training further. So what the program lacked is documentation. However, I found an article written by Nancy Santa Ana and she noted that statistical data on tests in reasoning and critical thinking before and after using community of inquiry yielded from 5% to 12%, and there is an increase in scores of students. This paper or this research was done by teachers from Philippine Normal University. Aside from Santa Ana, Jesus Antiquera of P. Gomez Elementary School was also selected Metro Bank's Outstanding Teachers of the Philippines. Antiquera used the community of inquiry in her classes, and the award-giving body praised her for her work, saying that her impact on students is remarkable, and her pupils became more engaged in terms of reflective, creative, and critical thinking. So philosophers who can identify good reasons make distinctions and connections, and they're also able to formulate probing questions. So, so I have to wrap up. So now I'm going to give you an updated list of scholars who are already working and progressing in their work on philosophy for children or the community of inquiry. So I hope that the list is clear enough. So to date, there is a growing number of Filipino philosophers who are willing to take part in training in-service teachers to do reflective thinking in their respective classes. Abigail Thea Canuto of the University of the Philippines wrote her thesis on critical thinking and the philosophical progress in dialogues of grade 2 children in a community of inquiry. She also handles philosophy courses at the UP College of Education, where she uses COI as a pedagogy. Rowena Azada Palacio started training with the Sapere in 2015. She attended trainings in UK, Singapore, and Korea, and she has already completed the Sapere Level 3 training. To date, she has trained approximately 400 teachers. Some have utilized the community of inquiry in their classes. Moreover, she also uses community of inquiry in her philosophy classes at the Ateneo de Manila, and according to her, she has students from teacher education program who were already able to utilize the program in their respective classes. Maria Loughlin Paclibar and Mark Joseph Calano, both from Ateneo de Manila as well, also trained with Philosophy with Children and Youth Network for Asia in Korea. And Peter Paul Elicor of Ateneo de Manila trained with the same organization in 2017. Leander Marquez and Kathleen Joy Alvarez of the University of the Philippines and myself joined the 2017 residential workshop with IEPC, Mendham, New Jersey. Aside from us, Glenda Oris is also an advocate of philosophy for children, and she has written several children's books already which are used in the practice. Dr. Rainier Ibana from the Ateneo de Manila used to host Karunungan Festival, which is an annual conference which gives workshop on P4C and community of inquiry. And the participants of the said workshop are mostly teachers coming from the public school. So, to summarize, putting theory into practice, community of inquiry and Sentex schools. So just a brief background. In 2012, Dr. Lee introduced P4C to Sentex Manila, which is an initiative project of Ayala Foundation Incorporated. So to date, they are already utilizing community of inquiry in their adopted schools. One would be in Sentex Manila and the other in Batangas. And there are also adopted schools in the provinces. According to them, they have trained most of their partner teachers already. So in conclusion, there is still a difficulty in implementing the program in the Philippines as discussed by Dr. Lee in his articles. However, there is a consistent growth in the number of scholars who are willing to train basic education teachers and work with public school teachers in implementing the program. There is also a growth in the number of teachers who are convinced to use the pedagogy in their respective classes. The democratic practice in the Philippine education system, where priorities of DepEd shifts every time a new president is elected, contributes to the difficulty in implementing the program. In addition, the priorities set by division heads is also an issue. The DepEd still adheres to the traditional method of knowledge transfer from teacher to student and is still resistant to new methods. So, just to add, for the last year, together with the Concilium Philosophy, we brought the practice already to Luna Elementary School. We did community of inquiry with ASL students, and it's a fruitful exchange between our students and their students. And in January, we are going to bring the practice to a rehabilitation center in Quezon City. And we're going to use community of inquiry with them, and they have requested particularly to discuss topics about justice, equality, values, family relation, and the idea of good and evil and morality. So it is clear now that there is a need to revisit the teacher education curriculum in the Philippines. As long as we do not change the way we look at how teachers are being trained, the case will remain the same. We cannot expect teachers to change their practice unless they have been well-grounded in theory and in reflective inquiry-based practice. Until they are able to understand the philosophy behind each pedagogical method, will they begin to gain full appreciation of the practice.
The fact that sila Marella are conducting training again at one school, which is just the university, is a good sign, I think. So it's like going full circle. Yung maganda kasi sa sinulat ni Marella, na-document na yung history na implementation of Feeding for Children because, of course, when we were introducing it, we were not concerned with the documentation. Pero tama siya na wala nga may nag-document na yung ginagawa. Basically, I have 4 comments on her paper. Things I think that need to be emphasized. The first is about deliberative communities. The idea that a group of people can share a certain concern with a certain problem, and they can put their minds together and think about that problem together. That is really what the community inquiry is all about. So the practice of deliberative communities. Alan Badiou, for example, mentions that before the French Revolution, the communards would discuss together in the communes regarding the issues that they were confronting about French society at that time. So the deliberations that the communards were undertaking, they have contributed to forging a certain kind of what you might call a collective will. So that before the French Revolution actually took place, there was a series of reflections by the communards regarding the direction that French society should take. So that the deliberative community of the communards helped prepare the way for what they would do. Ganun din ang nangyayari, I found out, I was reading an article in the New York Times regarding the student protest in Hong Kong. Kasi sa middle school pala sa Hong Kong, the teachers were somehow able to introduce a subject that deals with the problems facing Hong Kong. And so that the middle school students would participate in discussions regarding how they thought about the future of Hong Kong. So even before the student protests occurred, the educational system in Hong Kong had this opening, if you will, for the students to be able to talk about the problems confronting Hong Kong society. And that kind of curriculum innovation would not have been allowed by the Communist Party of the Philippines, Communist Party of China. Ibig sabihin, yung opportunity for the high school students to talk about the future of their society. In other words, you have deliberative communities wherein people are able to try out their ideas and ventilate and articulate what their hopes and aspirations are. And they realize that they share these hopes and aspirations pala with people their own age. So this is really what, Habermas and even John Rawls, Habermas's idea of the public sphere and John Rawls' idea of publicism, na nagkakaroon ng what might be called actually a collective mind. Because people are able to articulate ideas to one another and they get to share meanings and because of that deliberation, and nagkakaroon talaga ng what you might call shared mind, collective mind. That is what deliberative community can arrive at. The second is kasi siyempre kailangan i-condense ni Marella yung kanyang dissertation in the limited time that we have. One of the focal points actually of the community inquiry is to focus on the thinking that is going on. So it is not so much on what is being talked about, but really how it is thought about. Because if you develop the focus on thinking itself, sabi nga ni Paolo earlier, if you focus on the thinking itself, regardless of what you are going to think about, you will have a certain kind of expertise in thinking about that subject matter. Kaninong concern pa ba ang thinking if not philosophers? We are the only academic discipline that thinks about thinking in itself. so that philosophy is really the best equipped to focus on thinking, not just on logic or, well, reasoning, but really on the thinking process itself. So, Matthew Lipman talks about critical thinking, creative thinking, and lalo na caring thinking, which may sound like an oxymoron. No? Meron bang caring sa thinking? But Martha Nussbaum, for example, has elevated the discussion of emotions and thinking, not only in her upheavals of thought, but even in political emotions. So, I think emotions have a big role to play even in how we deliberate about something or what we deliberate about. So, the focus on thinking itself. Kasi, yun nga, yung nagiging problema sa DepEd, ayaw nilang pag-isipan na learning really occurs when you are thinking better. Karamihan ng mga teachers, sorry to say, do not want to think about thinking. Kasi, sir, masyadong mahirap yan eh. Masyadong puputi ang buhok namin dyan, sir. So, but you need to be able to think about thinking because so far we are transmitting knowledge from the present to our young. But our young will face problems in the future that we cannot imagine now. By 2050, the sea level rise will be so high that, I'm sorry to say, much of Manila will be flooded. So 30 years from now, how do we cope with problems of the future which we do not even imagine today? And the only handle we have is if the students have the capacity to think about these problems well. So it's really to focus on thinking. And so, of course, the next level is craftsmanship in thinking. What does it mean to think well or think better? And are we able to be craftsman-like in how we think? Kasi kung craftsman-like tayo, then there is really a certain kind of level of skill that we bring to our thinking, from clarifying the concepts, understanding what the question is all about, what are the possibilities for resolution, and then being able to, as it were, even imagine what are ways of thinking that even now we are not yet able to think about. So it's really craftsmanship in thinking. So pag naging focus natin ang craftsmanship in thinking, can you imagine how our children will be able to think about problems that we cannot even imagine today? So they might be better equipped precisely to confront those kinds of questions. And then finally, the focus on inquiry. That we confront questions, we think about questions together, because even if the questions are very difficult, if there are several minds that are focused on that question, perhaps we can provoke creative ideas in one another when we discuss these questions. So it's really the, as it were, maybe the culture of craftsman-like inquiry, so that we are able to bring together the creative ideas that are available precisely when we deliberate on those concerns. So yung apat, deliberative communities, the focus on thinking, craftsmanship in our thinking, and then the community of inquiry is really pushing for questions to investigate. Thank you.
Okay, the floor is open for your questions, comments, and reactions. Use the microphones on both sides. Identify yourself and your affiliation, and then to whom would you like to address your query. Thank you. Dr. Reyes.
Good morning, Marella and Sir Lee. Anyone can answer ko my question. Rene Reyes. Question is, was there an attempt to apply the community of inquiry to DepEd officials or to administrators? Kasi, of course, these people, for example, I know one university wherein it's occupied by officials coming from the sciences, and when they become officials, they treat the people or the university as a laboratory, to the point that because they have fixed notions of justice, power, and these fixed notions really affect how they treat their subordinates, their people. So,
based from my readings, the Doxos and his colleagues from UP, they brought the practice to Manila public schools, and they were in coordination with Manila DepEd. And for several years, they were training these teachers until the DepEd head, the supervisor for Manila, but the superintendent for Manila changed. And the person who replaced the superintendent whom they are in communication with or in contact with was a physical education major. So that was the reason why the program in Manila public schools stopped. But there has been several attempts already. It's just that DepEd is always resistant.
DepEd kasi is a bureaucracy. So, when PhD was Undersecretary for Projects and Development, a group of us, we talked with her and we discussed with her the possibility for implementing philosophy for children in the public schools. And of course, PhD is a very open-minded educator. She's always concerned with the education of her children. But the bureaucracy of DepEd is primarily concerned with keeping the children in school. Hiring teachers, constructing school buildings. Yung quality ng education para sa kanila, last priority. Kasi in itself, managing the bureaucracy is such a gargantuan task. No? Na kung isipin mo pa kung ano yung nangyayari sa classroom, parang dagdag na yun. Parang, they do not have the neurons, mental brain neurons to have to think about those problems. Kaya it will need to take leaders on the regional level or even lower. Kaya we were lucky kasi Paraluman Haron was my student in philosophy of education in UP. And when I talked with her about philosophy for children, she said, why don't we do it in Manila? Kasi also in the DepEd, you have to show exemplars, programs which work. And if it works, then the other schools or the other regions copy. So, yun nga, since it was done in Manila, like for example, Manila has something like 74 public schools. And naikot ko yun yung apat na red congressional districts ng Manila. Talking to principals mostly. Just so that the principals will allow their teachers. Kasi they're deviating from the curriculum a normal class period is 45 minutes. 45 minutes and then you have something like 45 students and then you have to deliver the course content for that day. Kasi the teachers are evaluated on the results of the exams. Mayroong achievement test sa grade 3 at saka grade 6. And kadalasan, bumababa talaga yung achievement score. No? So yun ang concern ng teachers. Kaya basta ma-deliver nila yung input, bahala na paano natututo yung students. Kasi in a way, sad to say, our teachers are not really concerned with learning. It's really just delivery. So that's where we are. It's a systemic problem. And unless and until we rethink the quality of education in our classrooms, the model is really banking. It's really transmission. And transmission that is not even very successful.
When you apply the community of inquiry, from my understanding, community applies a group of people, and in a sense, students in formal education setting. Would it then be applicable, the idea of community of inquiry, to a single student, such as in the form of tutoring? As for example, ma'am, in the first slide you showed the questions of your son. So I'm guessing that's a single student. Is it applicable for single students such as tutoring? And I guess this may be off the scope of the discussion, but I guess tutoring is only viewed as secondary or a supplement to formal education, in the sense that I would want to get tutoring to better my grades, my numerical value, rather than getting tutoring for the sake of learning. Let's say. Do you think that this stance should be changed? If so, how? And if not, then why not? Thank you.
Yeah. I wouldn't call it a community of inquiry. I mean, basically what happens when he raised that particular question, it's an inquiry-based communication that we are trying to establish. If it can be done between two people, as long as probably they're operating on the same, just to give you a background on where those questions came from. So he was playing with his cousin, and they decided to make questions. And his cousin started, she took her science textbook and started copying the questions from the textbook, which he needs to answer. And he was able to answer practically because all of these things are the things that they are doing in school, like the questions, what does it enumerate for things that a plant needs to grow. And because they're doing farming in school, he was able to answer it even if there was no science lesson yet. And then he started writing all those questions. Am I real? Is this house real? What is this food? And so on. That is a product, basically, by engaging him in inquiry. But by engaging him in inquiry, probably I'll call it an inquiry-based dialogue all the time. So if it is possible to do it, even if there are only two individuals present, it is possible. In a form of tutoring, that is exactly what I am doing. We are doing. I do not want to discount the father's participation in Fritz's yes. Pero siguro, I think, just to add, one of the more important thing that, if you would want to call it a tutor, is that the tutor should have an ear for, and the sensitivity to the questions which are being raised, so that the tutor or the facilitator will be able to address it better.
Siguro to add to that, Finland has one of the best educational systems in the world. Kung sino sa inyong education majors, you may have heard of it. In most of the international metrics, Finland students score very high. And they were able to achieve that because they did three important things. First, they made teaching a very remunerative career, so that the best and the brightest students would go into pedagogy. Teachers in Finland get as much as lawyers and doctors. So teaching became a very respectable career. They made entry into the educational colleges highly competitive, so that it's actually very difficult to enter into a normal school, an education college. Again, because they wanted to send out the message that we are looking for the best. And then third, you might be surprised to know, because the teachers are highly trained, they do not have a fixed curriculum. Ibig sabihin, the students are the ones who benchmark what they want to learn more of. At ang kagalingan ng guro na ipapakita niya na interconnected ang mga branches of knowledge. If you go into first, for example, into biology, later on you will go into chemistry, and then physics, and so on and so forth. Kasi yung mga teachers, magaling sila mag-guide. They are basically trained how to be facilitators of learning. So that yung quality ng learning ng mga students is really very much at their own pace. And they also, yung practice na they work in groups. Kaya pati yung mga classrooms nila are so designed that they can, kumbaga, shape-shift, if you like, depending on the kind of inquiry that they would like to do together. But there are no standard tests in Finland. They do not have a fixed curriculum. They just need to benchmark what their learning is. And because of that innovation, Finland students top international examinations. So it's been proven very successful. Malayo tayo doon. Kasi kadalasan, sorry to say, pag pumasok ka ng College of Education, dahil hindi ka nakapasok sa engineering o kaya sa STEM. So pupunta ka sa edu. Maging teacher ka lang. Yeah, so unfortunately.
Good morning po, Dr. Bolaños and Dr. Lee. I'm Renwaldo Incarna. My question is about a practical application of the concept because I just want to hear your reaction regarding the education of philosophy in the senior high school because as we could see, because I'm a baby of the old curriculum, so I was not blessed to have that philosophical underpinning in the senior high school. So my question goes like this. What is your reaction or your present comment about the teaching of philosophy in the senior high school? And the second question, because I was assigned in the rural area, particularly in Doña Remedios Trinidad, of which there are also schools who teach philosophy in the senior high. And the problem to that is sometimes philosophy is just being taught by a random English teacher or just a random teacher. And that doesn't give justice to philosophy without undermining their capabilities. So how could you apply this concept to rural areas such like that?
Maybe Doxos has a wider experience on this particular question, but I have trained three senior high school faculty members of three senior high schools already. And one of the problems that they are raising is really the training. They lack training. So how are we able to, siguro I think it is in the openness also of the administrators to allow their faculty members to attend trainings to equip themselves better. In relation to how education or how philosophy is being taught in the senior high school, I have to agree with you that there is a lack of preparation in terms of teachers teaching philosophy in senior high school because a lot of them, as you have mentioned, they're just random teachers, English teachers, some are religion teachers, some are somebody who does not have enough load is assigned to teach philosophy in senior high schools in the provinces. However, in my experience of having students who have been taught by philosophy majors, there is a huge difference. There is a huge. I would have to speak for the USD Senior High School, and most of the SHS teachers there are from the Department of Philosophy, and they have to transfer to senior high school. And I had a chance to handle most of their students, and in terms of the critical thinking of the students and their creativity and the way they're able to articulate their thoughts, there is a huge difference really. Kasi, again, because of the training of the teachers handling the course. So, but I think Doxos has a wider experience in terms of training teachers.
Ang problema talaga kung yung teacher hindi curious, hindi siya philosophical, in the sense na nagtatanong siya ng why questions. Pinakamahirap na question yung why. And if the teacher herself is not someone who questions, the tendency would be for the students not to question as much. Pero pag, in my experience, lalo na sa CENTEX sa Manila, CENTEX is the Center for Excellence in Elementary Education. Kasi we started with the teachers of the lower grades, kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2. And basically, we really just opened them up, the teachers, to inquiry, asking questions. Kasi sila din mismo, yung mga guro, hindi nabigyan ng pagkakataon, maski nung undergraduate years nila, na magtanong. So here, they were given the opportunity to ask questions, kasi gumagamit din ng short story or narrative, kasi tama yung nabanggit earlier ni Dr. Ada, na yung narrativity, mahalaga yun na merong narrative structure lang yung pinag-uusapan. But for the questions to be the starting point of the deliberation and the inquiry is something that the teachers themselves may have forgotten or may not really have had very profound experience in. So, in a way, kailangan ibalik yung sense of wonder sa mga guro. Kasi kung wala sila nun, they will not be able to cultivate that in the students. Diba? Kaya meron din silang pagtatanong tungkol sa kanilang sarili, tungkol sa kanilang pagtingin sa mundo, and so on and so forth. So that the teacher herself also needs to be, in a certain manner, philosophical, para magkaroon ng philosophical encounter. Or, well, as we professional philosophers sometimes talk about, to have delight in philosophizing. Natutuwa ka lang na namimilosopiya ka. Pag hindi ka kasi nagkaroon ng ganong uring karamdaman, hindi mo ma-appreciate ang namimilosopiya. Diba? So, kailangan magkaroon sila ng ganong klaseng sakit.
Just to follow up, ma'am, I don't know if this is being practiced or if it is applicable if there's a general module for even for non-philo teachers to understand philosophy and teach them to such rural areas or different senior high school. If there's a particular general module given by CHED or
There is a module actually, and it's found in the DepEd website, and the module is done by Dr. Manuel D. from Ateneo de Manila University. And the readings included in that particular modules are articles written by faculty members from Ateneo. It's just that, again, if the teacher is just going to read it, kasi these are article types if the teacher is not able to go back to the source of the, for example, if it's a discussion on Marcel, kung binasa lang ng teacher yung article na naandoon sa module at hindi niya naman din hindi rin siya ganun kabihasa kay Marcel, hindi niya rin naman yun maituturo ng maayos. So merong module na nanggagaling sa DepEd, yun nga lang talagang kulang yung training ng teachers para maituro siya talaga ng mas maayos.
Thank you and congratulations.